Hi, my name is Jackie Watson, and I'm a member of the Turid Jespersen Lodge of the Daughters of Norway, located in Orange County, California. This presentation is about the sloop restoration and the very first emigrants from Norway to America. Before we get started, I want to give credit and many, many thanks to our lodge's assistant cultural director and cultural director prior, Lindsay and Lila, prior to myself, who put on a really great previous presentation about immigration and Ellis Island. And that really inspired me to think about this topic. So, Lila and Lindsay, thank you very much.
We have a long sail ahead of us. Somewhere out there, America awaits. No one knows how long it will take, or what it's going to be like once we get there. So many questions are running through my mind. Will the ship hold? Will I ever see my parents again? And what is America really like? Do they even have sheep there? There is no turning back now. We need to leave everything behind us, because somewhere out there, on the other side, far, far away, awaits a whole new beginning.
Personally, I'm always really impressed, deeply impressed by the great courage it must take for people to leave their homeland and seek out someplace new for a new and better life. And so, my first question in researching this topic was, why would people leave? Norway was a beautiful place. 1825 in Norway. Um, about this time, the population in Stavanger, where the Restoration came from, the population was only about 20,000 people, as you can imagine, as it is still today. It's a beautiful country. Why? What was going on? After 278 years of rule by Denmark, Norway gained its independence in 1814, following the end of the Napoleonic Wars, right? And at that time, Denmark, which also, included Norway because they were ruled by Denmark, um, Denmark had supported Napoleon. And so, therefore, a Frenchman, gentleman born as Jean Bernadotte, later became the king of Sweden, known as Charles III. Um, Char- Charles III John, which later became, and as we know him, as Carl Johan, as in Carl Johan's Gata in Oslo, right? Carl Johan, how they got from John Bernadotte to Carl Johan, I don't know. But he also, because he's ruler of King of Sweden, he also becomes ruler over Norway. Anyhow, after these wars, these Napoleonic wars, there was an economic crisis in Norway, and the British in particular were looking to punish the Danes because they are, of course, allied with the French, and therefore they are going to punish the Norwegians. There was preferential treatment and taxes made from lumber, made on lumber, Norway's largest economic export, that ended up making that much more expensive than lumber from Canada. So the English were importing all of the Canadian lumber and not the Norwegian lumber, which of course caused a financial crisis, contributed to it in Norway. But there were also additional reasons to leave. And one of those reasons had to do with the role of religion. The Lutheran Church was, and of course is today, the official church of Norway. And this was, we always think of Norway as being, like all about the Lutheran Church, but that wasn't necessarily always the case. It happens that one of the leaders of the Restoration group, a man named Lars Larsen, had wanted to be a sailor from the time he was a little boy. And he started working cargo ships in 1807, but this was during the time of the Napoleonic Wars. And so the ship that he was on was captured by the British in the English Channel, and he and others were sent to prison, right? And the prisoners taken in the wars were, of course, not treated very well because, the English, they see these, you're basically representatives of the French, right? You're not British citizens. You are, captured during the Napoleonic Wars. You must be allied with the French. And so they weren't treated well. They were very, uh, had harsh conditions in the prisons in England. However, a group of people began to come and care for the prisoners, and these were Quakers. The Quakers who came to the English prisons, they came because they were pacifists. They didn't believe in the war. They wanted to care for the prisoners and show the their empathy and also their belief in peace. And they, of course, came and shared their religious beliefs with these prisoners. And this made a really big impact on Lars Larsen, who is going to become later a leader in the Restoration group. Lars Larsen became a Quaker thanks to this, preaching while he was in prison. And eventually, when he was released, he brought these Quaker ideas back to Norway. Upon their release, Norwegians who were with Lars, they all came back home, and they, reached out to some people around them and tried to also spread these ideas of the Quakers. But the government intervened because they strongly disapproved. The state religion was Lutheranism, and Quakerism was not allowed. Quakers were persecuted and threatened by the government, and it was not going to be acceptable at all. So that became a problem. Clang Pearson, if you are familiar at all with the sloop restoration, there's like some books by or and about Clang Pearson. He was a friend of Lars Larsen's and also a Quaker. And Pearson was the first to travel to America in the year 1821. No, yeah. Um, Pearson reached out in America, went out there on behalf of a group of Quakers in Stavanger who hoped that America might be a place that could provide greater religious freedom because, they felt oppressed in Norway for not being Lutherans. And also they really hoped for inexpensive farmland. And they had heard that, there was so much land in America. Oh, it's very inexpensive. They're practically giving it away. And the understanding was that this would be land that was easy to farm. I don't know if that was true, but Pearson returned to Norway to encourage the group to, hey, come on back to America. Let's give this a try. And the group of Quakers and friends in Stavanger began to make a plan to voyage across the Atlantic. So Pearson returns to Norway. He encourages everybody. A plan was set up to create a Quaker colony in New York. One of their jobs then as a group, in order to get to New York and build their Quaker colony, is they needed a ship. And the sloop Restoration was built, it was originally built as a fishing and a cargo. Was inexpensive. It was a used ship, but it had already been up and down the coast for many years, and so people thought, well, it's tested. Like we know it's not going to drown us out there. So why don't we take this ship and we will adapt it for our needs, and we'll use this to travel across the Atlantic to New York. This ends up being kind of a crazy ship for their purposes. First of all, the group is quite large. There are 52 people that are going to fit onto this ship, and it is a 54-foot long ship. It's only 16 feet wide. The picture that I'm showing you is from a replica, right, that was rebuilt just in recent years. It's actually about to be, we'll talk about this later, about to make a 200-year anniversary voyage across the Atlantic, retracing the steps of the original voyage. But it was built very faithfully in according to exactly what we believe the original restoration looked like. And if you notice the bow of this ship, the edges of the ship are like the walls are very low. So this is not really meant for people to be up on top of a ship, like up on board on the top deck, because in rough waters, this would be very easily, a situation where people could get bounced right overboard. This is not a place to hang out. Most of the time, the people on board the Restoration were hanging out below the deck. There's only one deck below, one level below. Climb down a ladder. Um, and it is less than 6 feet tall clearance below. It was extremely crowded. The ship's major, like the measurements are that it's 54 feet long and 16 feet wide. However, it is, of course, at the bow and the stern, it is quite narrow, and it is not fully 6 feet high. It's not quite as wide. It's quite small underneath, and it must have been extremely crowded. You basically have about 9 square feet of space per person, which that includes per person, including all of their stuff. So people were very regulated about how much they were allowed to bring with them, because this is a very crowded group on this ship. This is about 2.5 times more crowded, for example, than the Mayflower. Now, in my lodge, when I gave this presentation originally, we had taped out the dimensions of the ship on the floor, and everybody stood inside so that we could kind of get a sense of just how crowded it might have felt. But if you can imagine instead, online, maybe think of, compare the idea of two motorhomes about side by side. Your typical motorhome is about 30 to 45 feet long, so maybe a really big one. And 8 feet wide is the typical measurement of a motorhome. So two of them side by side is pretty much exactly what the Restoration is at its widest. Not that it's 16 feet all the way, it's not. But two motorhomes about side by side is about the same square footage, about the same space as the Restoration. And imagine 52 people in there, and that it's going to be quite a long voyage, right? So, how did people live aboard this ship? For me, it was important to actually go on this ship to see it myself so that I could explain it. And I feel very fortunate to the Friends of the Restoration Society who have done this, rebuild this replica and made it available for us to go tour. Wow. They explained to us that on board the ship, there were custom built, very narrow, very short bunks and hammocks. People and children slept two per bunk. There was a galley with a stove and a water tank up on deck that had to be nailed down because, of course, like we said, the walls around the edges, we're not going to keep those things on the deck, especially not in any kind of waves or any kind of weather. So you couldn't cook underneath. You didn't have any didn't have a good much in the way of space. Each family was allowed to bring one wooden chest for the whole family, and they built them custom so that everything would be stackable so that it would all fit. And so they were exactly 5 feet long, 2 feet wide, 2.5 feet tall, and that had to be it. That was everything that you were taking with you to America. I imagine that would have been very difficult to pack and to make those decisions. The people on board had a pretty limited diet of things. They knew that it had to be things that they could make that would last. So they brought dried meat and fish, bread, potatoes, peas, which of course, yeah, pea soup, peas, which were, dried and could be made, rehydrated, like made into soup and such. They brought hard cheeses, liquor, beer, and wine. There was a teacher in the group who gave daily lessons on deck for the children. And interestingly, the group had heard that if you brought iron bars, that would have a lot of value in New York. So you'd be able to like, since you didn't have American currency to bring, they could bring these iron bars and they would be able to trade that in New York for American dollars. And that would help them to be able to buy their land. And that was the hope. I don't know, that didn't end up happening, so working out incredibly well as it happened, but it added a lot of weight. Maybe it made this sailing a little bit smoother with that weight in the in the bottom. I don't know. Here's a picture of the Restoration replica. Not a huge deck. So, who was on board? Then in total, there were 52 people who left, who were on board for the entire trip. There actually were a few more originally, including some of my family, my ancestors, who, when they first left the harbor, they headed directly out into the Atlantic into a huge storm. They decided to turn back for a little bit of shelter from the storm and waited out just a little bit, at which time some of my family members got off and decided to stay in Norway. 52 passengers continued on, plus one baby was born on the trip. There were 6 families who were owners of the ship, and their names are listed here: the Larsens, Steens, Nelsons, Torresons, Rosdales, and the Madlins. Madlins are my family. There were 3 other families who were not co-owners, and there was a random assortment of individual young men who were kind of scouting it out and, probably for their own families to come later on. The group as a whole were known as the Sloopers, and that's because the Restoration, the kind of ship that they were sailing in, was known as a sloop. And so if you ever look into the history of the Restoration, you might find the Slooper Society, which is located here in the United States. Okay, so the voyage. The voyage itself took 98 days, so just over 3 months. That's a really long time to be crowded in that little tiny ship. They start, of course, in Stavanger, Norway. They left on July 4th, 1825. So as I record this, that is, this summer is going to be the 200-year anniversary, and the replica of the Restoration is going to retrace that same trip that the Sloopers made in 1825, 200 years later. They, you would think that they might go straight across the Atlantic and in like kind of a direct way, but actually they had to move with the trade winds to be efficient. The first thing they did was actually stop in England, which was interesting because that turned out to be a little bit of a problem. Let me see. Yeah, okay. I'll come to that in a second. They stopped in England first, and then they went to the island of Madeira, which was owned by Spain. They then continue across the Atlantic towards the Bahamas, and then from the Bahamas, they moved north to New York, arriving in October of 1825. So let's talk a little bit about some of their adventures, starting in England. In England, the Sloopers were stopping to resupply. And while they were there, the women thought that they would make a little money selling a little of their hard alcohol that they had kind of home brewed. Make a little cash for the voyage. Maybe that would help them to stock up on some extra supplies. Unfortunately, they did not realize that this was illegal, and so when the captain of the ship found out, he really kind of panicked and worried, oh my gosh, you're going to get us arrested. We're all going to end up in jail. So he wants to hustle everybody back onto the ship and take off and leave before they get arrested. Unfortunately, by doing that, they left without adequate supplies, and they ended up running out of water off of the coast of Morocco, and this is where they become close to Madeira. Interestingly, off the coast of Madeira, they found a bottle of Madeira wine, and this barrel was like a oak barrel that was adrift at sea. And apparently what happened is that they were so excited and probably dehydrated from having run out of water. So they overindulged in the wine and became quite drunk. They were drunk to the point of having passed out on the deck and below the deck, and so anybody that saw them would have been quite concerned that they might have looked dead. So what ends up happening is that as the trade wind started to carry the ship closer and closer to Madeira's main harbor, the people on board the Restoration failed to raise their flags, and that caused a panic in the harbor, and especially among the soldiers who were stationed there. So the the Portuguese get very concerned. They see all these people that look dead on the board, on deck of this ship, and they're very concerned because this looks like to them a plague ship. The Portuguese ready their ship or ready their cannons and get ready to fire on the ship, because the best thing for them to do is to sink it before it comes into the harbor and spreads plague. They don't want anything to endanger themselves on the island of Madeira. So the Portuguese get ready to fire and sink the Restoration. Oh no. So fortunately, this actually did not end up happening. A German ship that was passing the Restoration finally was yelling and screaming and caught their attention. And at least in one account, a woman from the Restoration was below the deck. She heard the Germans shouting, so she came up on the deck. And she somehow tries to understand like the situation from the Germans, and the Germans are recognize that she's okay, she's alive, they're fine. And so she somehow understands what's going on, but she doesn't know how to raise the flags. She doesn't even know which flags to raise. So instead, she took off her skirts and waved them around furiously in the air to signal the fort that was at the coast, or the near the harbor at Madeira. And by furiously waving around her skirt, she was signaling that, hey, we're okay, we're please, please basically don't fire on us, have some mercy on us, kind of like waving a white flag. And eventually the soldiers at the fort decided to stand down upon seeing her, and fortunately did not end up firing. Instead, interestingly, there was an American embassy at Madeira, and the American ambassador there actually welcomed in the sloopers and held a great big dinner for them, actually ended up restocking all of their supplies and giving them food and water and wine and everything they needed for the rest of their journey. And so their very first contact with Americans was here in Madeira, and ended up being a really positive one and kind of an early welcome to America. All right. When the sloop Restoration finally arrives in New York in October of 1825, it didn't look like the New York that we might imagine. There was no Statue of Liberty there yet. The Statue of Liberty wasn't in place until 1886. There was no Ellis Island. Ellis Island didn't open up. There was an island, but there was no immigration center. If you've ever been there to the museum there, they like have the halls that the immigrants went through and all the crazy stuff that they did to mark immigrants and check under their eyelids for disease and all these things. That didn't start happening until the immigration center opened up in 1892. So those things just didn't happen like we think of in the movies or in stories. Their arrival in New York was uh, not as eventful maybe as we might have thought, in terms of them getting accosted by immigration officials. Instead, the first thing that ends up happening is that they sailed right up the East River and they docked, and the local press corps showed up. And the local press were like, who are these crazy looking people? The Norwegians must have looked very strange to the New Yorkers, to the Americans. They were all wearing homespun fabrics, and they sounded and looked funny, and it wasn't German, and it wasn't a language it wasn't people that were very common, right, in New York, because these were the first Norwegians really to emigrate there. So they show up and they start getting some attention from the local press. So Clang Pearson came to greet the sloopers, as did many of the local Quakers in New York. The Quaker families in Manhattan, there turned out to be quite a lot of them. They hosted the Norwegians in their homes, and these Quakers had really influential friends, and they hoped to contact President Adams for assistance with the kind of New York officials who were attracted by the press and by all this kind of, buzz in Manhattan. Um, from Manhattan, the emigrants boarded a second boat on the Hudson River. And from here, they headed up north towards Albany and upstate. As they traveled on they traveled on the Hudson River, which then it became the very, very newly opened Erie Canal. But it wasn't the way that you would think, like this big, huge, wide, river and canal, the way it is today. Instead, what happened is that they're on this new ship. They're not able to actually sleep on the boat. The boat itself has to be pulled by a barge and then pulled up by like through a whole system along the river through locks, and they're basically using ropes tied to the ships and the barge, and horses and mules actually pulled the ropes and pulled the barge and the ship up along the Erie Canal. So these, like the whole lock system was not quite as advanced as we think of it being today. The sloopers, the Norwegians, they actually camped out on the sides of the river each night because they're trying to not, it's not a big wide river. It's not, there's not this, it's not a huge boat anymore. We're talking about something much smaller just to carry their supplies, their big chests, right? So they sleep on the banks of the river each night as they head further and further north towards the farmland that Clang Pearson had purchased and prepared for them. And that's going to be their, Quaker colony, right? Their Norwegian Quaker colony. Unfortunately, there were some legal troubles caused at this time. So the arrival of the Norwegians and the Restoration did cause a bit of a stir in New York Harbor. It was the smallest ship, and this is part of the buzz in addition to the Norwegians and their homespun clothes and whatnot. But it was also the smallest ship known to have crossed the Atlantic Ocean with emigrants on it. And it was a bit shocking that that ship could even have made it, and especially with so many people. The ship was so overcrowded that the sloop violated American law upon arrival. Under American law at that time in 1825, only 17 people would have been a legal size, proper legal size for the ship, and they had 52. Well, 53 if you count the baby. So obviously they are way overloaded. Because of this, the ship is such, is seen as being so dangerous that the New York officials actually arrested the captain and seized the ship, which is kind of a problem. The ship is actually part of what the sloopers had hoped to be able to use and sell when they got to America. They need that. They don't need the ship, but they need the money. But fortunately, President John Quincy Adams intervened, and he actually pardoned the captain from criminal charges, but the owners were still fined. And so what ended up happening is that the ship and its cargo of iron was seized, and it was sold, all of it, for $400. That's about $12,000 in today's money, which, as you can imagine, was far less than they were hoping for. And it was even far less than they had paid for the ship. And that was before they had done all these other, like the fixes to it and upgrades to it to cross the ocean. So it was a huge disappointment to lose that much, lose that much capital. So some end notes, right? In the end, there is a slooper society, right? Based on these people, the sloopers, they actually ended up staying in New York and upstate New York for a few years. And then they traveled to a place called Fox River, Illinois. And then plenty of others began to continue on even further west. Some continued on to Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, California, Washington. There's even tales of some going to Australia because there's like cattle ranches there. Today's Slooper society is the descendants of all of these people as they moved all across America. And today there are about 20, it's estimated there are about 20,000 descendants. That seems like it's probably actually kind of low to me, and that estimate might be a little outdated. Um, let's see. There is a replica, as I discussed, the ship pictures that are here, and you can see on the top picture that's that's the ship, the replica of the Restoration next to a parking lot, so you can see it kind of near people and cars, and that is not a large ship. The replica is docked outside of Stavanger. It's a little bit north of the city, and is planning for its 200-year anniversary sailing to begin on July 4th of this year, 2025. I have a little personal connection here because of my family, which were the Madelyns. The Out of the Madelyns that decided to go on the ship, there were 6 children and their 2 parents. As I told you earlier, there were some people that, because of the storm, decided to get off of that crazy ship. They did not want to go out to the ocean in that. And so what ended up happening is only 3 of the 6 children came with their parents on the sloop in 1825. 2 of those 3 emigrated later with their families, and that's where my family, like my descendants, were one of the ones that stayed and then went later. And only one ended up staying behind in Norway. However, we were able to find the farm that is based on that branch that left behind, and some cousins. So those are our cousins, which was really fun. This is the Madeline farm as we found it. My mom and I found it in 2023. It was in a pretty sad state. What you see here is in the middle section is the actual farmhouse where the Madelyns lived. And this is like a barn area to the left, and animal, like a lean-to type shed where there would have been maybe cows, goats, sheep. That's actually it's really like low. Most of it is really low, and you couldn't really, like, animals could, like goats and sheep could stand up in it, but people could only stand up in only a portion of it. But it was connected right next to the house, which probably provided some extra additional warmth. Interestingly, there's still an animal trail leading out from the side of that little lean-to out into that birch forest kind of next to it. And then, as you can see, there's this long path that kind of heads up towards the farm. Um, it- at the other end of the long path from the farm is a beautiful, beautiful lake, which was very moving when we got to actually be standing on this land, which I think we understand belongs to um, a, a some kind of a church leader of some variety, not really sure. But when we were actually able to stand on this land, it was so beautiful. It made me cry to think about all the people who, how much they had to leave behind. They left something so beautiful, and it must have been so very difficult to do. And it must have taken an awful lot of courage to embrace that for something that you wouldn't know. You wouldn't know what was on the other side of the ocean. It was brave and courageous, and I admire it and respect it a lot. So anyhow, thank you very much for listening to this presentation about the Restoration. I hope you really enjoyed it and learned something. And if you are interested in learning more about the Sloopers, you can find more on the Slooper Society website at sloopersociety.org. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.